Next on Rock Story.
There were groups of people that were just saying, back up, back up.
Concerts gone bad.
Why did 11 people die at a rock concert?
Crushed in the crowd.
Couldn't breathe, I thought I was dying.
And those who survived.
I could feel their shoes, just kind of grinding up against the bones of my legs.
Then,
nobody takes great pride in killing anybody or hurting anybody. I don't.
The grim legacy of Altamont.
Somebody had to die.
Plus,
people do go crazy, people do snap.
Woodstock 99, what really sparked the rage.
Why are people ending on this note?
This is Rock Story, VH1's look at the rock and roll moments that affected a generation. Remember the rush you got when you found out your favorite band was coming to town? Finally, a chance to see them live, in person, performing the songs you couldn't get enough of. There's no doubt about it. For rock fans, going to a concert is the ultimate thrill. But unfortunately, sometimes the excitement ends in disaster. In this edition of Rock Story, a look at 3 concerts that were tragically upstaged by the drama that happened offstage. We'll start in Cincinnati with an event that took lives, forever changed the survivors, and shook up the entire concert industry.
I couldn't breathe, I thought I was dying.
It's crazy. Everybody was stamping on everybody.
Police officers were advising us that people were down.
All of the dead were young, 15 to 22 years old.
It was just impossible for us to get in through the crowd to do anything.
Today in Cincinnati, stunned city officials are trying to learn what went wrong last night outside a rock concert by a British group called The Who.
It was billed as one of the biggest concerts to hit Cincinnati. But what happened outside The Who's show on the night of December 3rd, 1979, has gone down as one of the most tragic events in rock history.
The Who were in Cincinnati for one night, so getting tickets to that show was a pretty exciting thing.
Diana Kubert was 20 years old and one of the 18,000 fans who got a ticket to the sold-out concert.
You're very lucky to have tickets to it, and so friends were very envious when they found out you were going.
The thought was, this might be our only chance to see The Who.
Dan Smith was an 18-year-old college freshman. He and his 2 best friends were rabid Who fans.
In the weeks prior to the concert, we listened to a lot of The Who, probably every album. It was part of the event that we were going to and getting excited about going down to the concert.
The show was at the Riverfront Coliseum, a private arena that hosted all the big rock bands in the 70s. Like all concerts there, most tickets were general admission. There were few assigned seats.
To get a good spot in the arena, you needed to get there early. And we got there at 5 o'clock. We just felt like, we could wait, for a couple hours, no problem.
There was a pretty good crowd standing outside. It was really no different than any other concert.
So we just staked out a position at the very edge of that crowd.
By and large, the crowd was not as rambunctious as many other crowds tended to be.
Cincinnati police officer Dale Minkhouse was head of the security detail outside the Coliseum that night.
But there was definitely a very, very strong feeling of excitement and an anticipation. You could just sense that.
It was just a happy group of people standing around waiting for the doors to open.
But the frigid December wind and the looming showtime drew more and more people toward the closed doors.
By 6 o'clock, it started getting tighter and tighter.
And it's just like any typical concert, if you wanted to turn around and walk out of it, you could easily do that at that time.
Within minutes, the crowd swelled again by another few hundred fans.
The crowd had completely engulfed us.
It was so tight that you couldn't see, your feet. You couldn't really move. You couldn't look down.
It got so large so quickly that we really needed to get people inside the facility as quickly as possible. At 6:30, when the doors didn't open, I started contacting the decision makers inside to find out why they hadn't opened and when they would open.
I was being kind of carried forward with the flow of the crowd.
You were actually getting lifted up off of your feet and moved 3 or 4 feet.
That pressure just kept building and building, and there was nowhere for anyone to go. We were just stuck.
At 10 till 7, Mink House got an answer from the Coliseum security director.
I was told that they couldn't open the doors until the Who group do their sound checks.
I remember hearing the sound check.
You could hear the music inside, and a lot of people thought that the concert had already started.
There was a sense of urgency. We're missing the show.
People started to push forward.
You had to put your arms up in a defensive kind of fashion like this to protect your rib cage.
You could clearly see the crowd very, very tightly compacted up against the doors.
You just keep thinking, well, they're gonna, free this up and let us get in there.
But the doors didn't open. At 7:15, Mink House rushed inside to track down the Coliseum manager and promoter.
Basically told them, we need to get everything open right now. We can't wait. Open all the doors.
Despite his plea, the doors stayed closed.
The response was that they were limited in the number of ticket takers they had, and they couldn't use other people on the doors for fear of violating union contracts, and they'd do the best they could.
It was getting hard to breathe, and I had to pretty much stand on my toes to try to get air.
People were just mashed together.
It was a sea of people. 12,000 people, very tightly compacted.
A few times, the crowd would sway.
When this crowd movement would occur, it would kind of release all that heat, and like a ball of steam, would just puff out of the crowd. A few people passed out standing up.
Then, you really start to panic.
Just before 7:30, some of the 6 main doors opened.
There was a cheer in the crowd, and the crowd compressed by another third.
I remember screaming for people to stop pushing because it hurt, it hurt a lot.
There were groups of people that were just saying, back up, back up.
All of a sudden, my body started going forward with the crowd. I was within 5 feet of the doorway.
I started getting a little bit closer to that area right in front of the door.
All of a sudden, I could feel that there was something down on the ground.
I could see this pile of people.
My body started going forward, but my feet was hung up on something on the ground.
There was movement to the pile.
And that caused me to completely fall forward and land on the concrete. When I was laying there, I remember, seeing people going over top and going in through the door. I could feel, their shoes, just kind of grinding up against the bones of my legs. Someone had fallen on my head, and that was the scariest moment, when I couldn't breathe. I was frantically jerking my head from side to side, trying to get air.
I heard people say, this person is dying here.
I was beginning to wonder then, if I really was going to get out of there.
Diana went to the show with her brother and his girlfriend, but they got separated in the crush. She was now alone in the panicked crowd. When Rock Story returns, Diana's desperate plight.
All I could do was think, I've got to scream, I've got to scream, I've got to let them know that I'm down here.
Then, 6 bands, 300,000 fans, and the Hells Angels.
Well, we're going to go there to make sure that there was no any murders going on.
While thousands of Who fans struggled in front of the main doors of Cincinnati's Riverfront Coliseum, fans at the entrances on the other side of the venue comfortably walked inside. They had no idea of the life and death drama that was unfolding out front.
All I could do was think, I've got to scream, I've got to scream, I've got to let them know that I'm down here.
After 10 minutes on the ground, Diana Kubert was pulled out of the crush and into the lobby of Riverfront Coliseum.
I had no shoes on. My face was pretty bloody. My legs were in pretty bad shape. I was hurting pretty bad.
About 20 feet back from the door, we did find a female victim. Her skin was blue.
Just before 8, Officer Dale Minkhouse rushed the victim to the Coliseum's first aid room.
I pushed on the door and it was locked. I started pounding on the door, and a private security guard opened the door. I said, "Let us in, we've got a bad one." He said, "I can't, there's no room." And at that point, he opened the door, and literally every square foot of floor space had a body. And it wasn't until that point that I really understood how big this event had become.
Moments later, Dan Smith made it into the lobby.
I remember them carrying a person who was obviously deceased. And that's when I knew, you know, there's something going on here.
We called for every life squad, every ambulance in the city. We used every resource the city had available at that point in time.
My brother and one of the guys from the medical center carried me over to one of the ambulances. Right away, they had to cut my clothes off because by then my body had swelled up so much that there was no way that they could remove my clothes without cutting them off. I was pretty hysterical. I was thankful, you know, that I was breathing, that I was alive.
There were bodies laying everywhere, some that were dead, many that were injured.
The scene was shocking. Bodies littered the entranceway.
There was a news flash that there were 6, 7 dead people at the Riverfront Coliseum at the concert.
Paul Wertheimer was the public information officer for the city of Cincinnati. He got to the scene around 8:30.
When I arrived, they were still removing some of the bodies. There were paramedics and others frantically doing their job.
There's so much havoc at the time.
There were piles of clothing, piles of shoes that had been abandoned or had been torn or ripped or taken from the people in the crowd.
Unaware of what was happening outside, thousands of fans who walked in through the Coliseum's other entrances waited for The Who.
The group of friends that had come in a separate set of doors, they asked me if it was raining outside because I was completely soaking wet. And I said, no, I think something terrible happened out there.
A few minutes later, The Who took the stage.
I was enjoying the concert, but I didn't know the enormity of it at that time.
And there were two worlds going on. The world inside Riverfront Coliseum where everything was all right, and the world outside where the situation wasn't all right.
We didn't find out until after the show. And Bill Curbishley, who has a manager, his face was like slate. And he said, if you're going to do an encore, please make it brief, because something very, very serious has happened.
Thousands of people were gathered waiting to get into the show.
They all just started to push.
That's when the problem developed.
One massive wave.
The bodies appear to have died of trauma.
Those are the grim details.
When we left the concert, we're listening to the reports on the radio. That was pretty eerie.
I didn't really know that someone had died until later on that evening at the hospital. And once I found out, I was shocked, because then I realized, what I tripped up on, because at the time, I knew that there was something on the ground, something pretty big, but I never dreamed that it was a body laying there.
Just before 11 o'clock, Mink House and Cincinnati's mayor held a press conference.
At 7:54, we found the first bodies.
It was official. 11 fans had died. Over the next 24 hours, the fans, the families, the band, and the city of Cincinnati tried to cope with what had happened.
We just feel helpless at the moment. There doesn't seem to be anything we can do about last night. We just hope to hell it doesn't ever happen again.
We received flowers from the Who. My brother who was killed loved the band. For Karen, it was her first concert.
How many doors were there enough doors open?
There's no one reason for this happening.
Just the beginning of the questions that are going to be raised about the worst incident in the history of rock and roll.
The next day after the tragedy, of course, the big questions were, why did 11 people die at a rock concert? How did this happen? And who was responsible?
They tried to blame the crowd, a bunch of young people on drugs to see this rock concert, and that's what caused it, and it wasn't that at all.
There was an incredible amount of misinformation. It was difficult to ferret out truth from fiction.
The first reports we heard, people died at the Who concert in a stampede.
That didn't happen. It was not a stampede.
It was a slow crush.
Based on the coroner's reports, all died from asphyxiation.
I remember a headline in the Cincinnati Enquirer In big, bold letters, it said, "All deny responsibility."
There was, the unanswered question as to what caused it that night.
2 days after the concert, Cincinnati's mayor set up a task force. Wertheimer was put in charge.
We had to do something to counter this disaster. We had to find some answers.
Why did they have to try to squeeze 10,000 people into 4 doors? That's just a completely unsafe, inhumane way of treating people.
For whatever reason, the Coliseum, they chose to keep those doors closed, And to me, that's what, caused a lot of the problems that night.
No one had ever died at Riverfront Coliseum, but this wasn't the first time there were problems with a crowd waiting to get into a show. These letters, sent by concertgoers to the city council and the Coliseum's president, warn of impending disaster. All were written in the 3 years prior to the Who concert.
There was a history of problems with the Coliseum, of abusive treatment of fans. There were complaints not just from fans, but from parents and from adults who had gone to events there and seen how it had been run.
There's no question in my mind that festival seating was the root cause of the Who concert tragedy.
When people buy a festival seating ticket, everybody has a perception of that perfect place in front of the stage, in front of their favorite performer.
They will truly risk life and limb to get to their choice spot. It is nothing but an accident waiting to happen.
On more than one occasion, Cincinnati's city council debated the problems at Riverfront Coliseum, but it never took action.
I remember Coliseum officials or their representatives saying, you know what, these police, they don't understand concerts. This is what the kids want. This is what rock and roll is about. We can't stop it.
3 weeks after the Who concert, the city council banned festival seating.
This was not a rock and roll tragedy. This was a crowd management tragedy.
Shortly after the concert, the victims' families and the injured filed a multi-million-dollar civil suit against the city, the Coliseum, the promoter, and the Who. But the case never went to trial. The defendants' insurance companies settled out of court for an undisclosed amount of money. None of the parties was forced to publicly take responsibility for the events that claimed 11 lives.
I was disappointed that it never, went to trial because I was really hoped that, the truth would come out.
Nobody's come forward to repent. Nobody's come forward to say, I'm sorry. And because of that, there's still a wound suffered by those concert goers who were there.
It's something that will always be with me. It's a real unique thing. It wasn't a natural disaster that we didn't have any control over. It was a preventable thing.
It's a piece of my life that is always going to be there. It'll never go away. It's my day in infamy. I don't ever want to see anything worse than that.
I think it was one of those, things where you try to block it out as much as possible, with something that you wish you could forget, even though you can't.
Rock Story producers asked the promoter and the management from the former Riverfront Coliseum to tell their side of the story. But both parties declined Rock Story's repeated requests for an interview. Up next,
this was violence for the sake of violence.
hate consumes the last party of the love generation.
This was evil.
And later, 3 more days of peace and music go up in flames.
Oh my God, they're burning the whole place down.